In our first two examples, we took a look at a simple gradebook class that consisted only of one method named displayMessage. In the first case, it took no parameters and simply displayed a hard-coded string. And in the second case, when we called the method, we passed in a course name and used that as part of the message that was displayed. In both examples, we showed you how to create an object of that new gradebook class and use it to invoke the displayMessage method to display the message on the screen. Now, those two classes were not very realistic. Most classes that you create are going to have both data and methods to manipulate that data. And in this next example, we're going to be introducing a couple of key concepts. The first is the concept of an instance variable. When you're defining a class that represents a real-world concept, the instance variables of the class represent the attributes of an object. So for example, I mentioned in an earlier part of our discussions the concept of an employee class. Every employee has a first name and a last name, and those would be attributes of the class employee. And the way that you would store that information for every individual employee is in an instance variable for the first name and an instance variable for the last name on an object by object basis. For every instance of the employee class that you ever create, there would be a separate instance variable for that employee's first name and for that employee's last name, and those instance variables would be separate copies from other employee objects. Similarly, for the concept of a gradebook, we're going to maintain the course name individually for every gradebook object that we create. So if you think about the concept of a paper gradebook, typically you would have one page per course in the paper gradebook, and on that page you would list maybe the course name and the course number and the list of students, and down the left side maybe, and across the top you'd have all the different exams and homework assignments, and in the middle of the grid you would have the grades for each individual student on each exam or homework assignment. So all of that information is for one course, and then each individual page represents a different course. And similarly, you would put that information, you would describe that information as the instance variables of class gradebook, and then you would provide corresponding methods, and as you'll see in this example, a concept called a property or several properties for manipulating the data inside the gradebook. And in our case, we'll be performing those manipulations from our gradebook test class once again. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is run this program so you can see it in action. So as we have done in the prior examples, we're going to create a gradebook object. In this example, the first thing we do is show you that the initial value of our course name in our gradebook object is the empty string. There's no contents for that variable yet. The actual value of that variable is null, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the source code. You can see that once again it's prompting me to enter a course name, so let's go ahead and type a course name, Intro to C# Programming. And when I press enter, you can see that it once again displays the welcome message containing the course name. So in terms of the output of this program, it doesn't look a whole lot different from what we did in the prior program, but the gradebook object in this program actually contains both data and functionality for manipulating that data, and that's what we're going to take a look at here. Now for this program, I'm going to take a look first at the gradebook test class so you can see how we're going to use class gradebook. Then we'll go and look at the implementation of the class. So as you can see here, my gradebook test class once again consists of just a main method that's going to specify what the program should do. And as we did in the first two examples, we begin in main by creating a gradebook object, which we're naming my gradebook, and that variable now refers to the new gradebook object that you see being created on the right side of the equal sign. Now the next thing we do at lines 14 and 15 is display the initial value of the course name that's stored in that gradebook object. So one of the key features of this example is showing you how to store data in an object. So you can see we're doing a console.writeLine statement. And the format control string here, initial course name is, and we're going to place in the placeholder between these single quote characters the value of mygradebook.coursename. Now on the left side of this dot is the mygradebook variable that we created back here at line 11, which refers to the new gradebook object. And on the right side is what we call a property name. In this case, the name of the property is course name with a capital C. And a property is interesting in that you can use a property by default to get a value out of an object or to set a value in an object as well. So here we're saying take the current value of the course name property of the gradebook and display it. Whereas down here on line 19 we're saying place a new value into the course name property of the mygradebook object. So if I stop here for a moment and run this program, once again, we can see the initial course name is the empty string, and that's what was displayed here. And right now we're about to execute we are executing line 19. It's waiting for me to enter the course name here. It's already prompted me to enter the course name, so we can see that if I move the output window up a little bit. So it's waiting for me to enter a line of text, and again, if I type CS 101, Intro to C# Programming, and press enter, when I press enter, the value from console.readline is going to be assigned to the course name property of the mygradebook object. Now the mygradebook object is one object of class gradebook. I could have many objects of class gradebook, but the only one that's going to be modified is the one that's on the left side of the dot operator in this particular statement. So let me go ahead and press enter, and at that point it displays the message because down at line 23 we told the mygradebook object to display its message. Now you'll notice, unlike the previous example, that we're back to calling display message with no arguments. From this code here, it looks like I didn't tell it what the course name is, but I did. It's stored in the object already, and the display message method knows about that data, as we will see in the class definition in a moment, and can use that data to perform its task. So one of the things you'll find if you're not already an object-oriented programmer is that when you define methods, there are many cases in which a method will receive no parameters because the method already is associated with the data that it needs to manipulate. It's wrapped together with that data into an object of the class and helps encapsulate that data so that we can process it however we define. So we'll talk more about that issue as we look at the source code for class gradebook in a moment. So that's the main test program. Let's go back over now to the gradebook.cs file, which defines the class. And as we've done previously, we have a public class called gradebook, and it starts with its body at line 7 and ends at line 31. So we can take a look at the full body here if I scroll up a little bit. And we now have 3 pieces in this class definition. We have the display message method once again, which is going to be used to display the welcome message containing the course name. But now we also have 2 additional pieces. At the beginning of the class, we have what's known as an instance variable. When you declare a variable inside the curly braces of your class's body, but not inside any of the methods, or as you'll see, this thing here is called a property, that variable is considered to be an instance variable of the class. And what that means is every time I create a gradebook object, that gradebook object will have its own copy of the instance variable course name. Thus, if I have 10 different gradebooks, there will be 10 different course name variables in memory, 1 per object of the class. Now we declare most data of our classes, most instance variable of our classes, as private so that we as the designers of the class have complete control over what that variable is allowed to store. And basically what that does is it allows you to do things like validating the data that you're placing into an object of the class. So let's just say, for argument's sake, that the course name has to be a maximum of 25 characters for some reason. By making the data private before allowing a course name to be stored in this variable, I could check the length of the string, and if it's too long, I could do something like truncate that string down to the maximum number of characters, or I could potentially report an error back to the caller indicating that they provided something that doesn't meet the requirements of the class and that they have to try again. So our course name variable initially is declared private here to say that it's known only within the curly braces of this class definition called gradebook. If I define a variable named course name in some other class, it is not the same as this course name variable. Now, typically when you have instance variables in C#, you're going to provide properties for manipulating those instance variables. And a property is basically a shorthand syntax for a method that allows you to get the value of an instance variable and another method that allows you to set the value of an instance variable. You don't use method syntax when accessing a property. So for example, here we're saying get the value of the course name property from my gradebook and use it in this console.writeLine statement. And here we're saying set the value of the course name property in the myGradebook object to whatever is supplied on the right side of the assignment. And in both cases, notice that there is no set of parentheses following the property name. Automatically, based on the context in which the property is used, it will figure out for me if it needs to get the value of that property or to set the value of that property. So going back over to our code here, the way you define a property, in this case we made it a public property because we want the so-called client code, the gradebook test class that's using a gradebook. We want that class to be able to access the course name inside of a gradebook object, but we want to do it in a manner that we control. So the property is defined to be a string property because the instance variable it manipulates is a string. Normally the property name matches up with the instance variable name but has a capital first letter. That is not a requirement, but it is a common convention. And then within the property's curly braces, we have a get accessor that's capable of returning the current value of the instance variable, and then separately a set accessor that's capable of modifying the value of an instance variable. And in each case, notice that we're using the variable course name that was declared back here at line 8 with a lowercase c. And we're able to do that because the course name property definition is inside the same class, inside the same class as the course name instance variable definition. In fact, everything within the scope of this set of curly braces for our class is known to everything else. The method display message can use the property and can use the variable directly. The property can use method display message if it wanted to, and the instance variable directly. Instance variables are just data storage, so they can't go use a property or a method, but everything within the class knows about everything else within that class. And there are exceptions to that which have to do with static variables and static methods and static properties. We'll get into the static keyword in much more detail in a later lesson. So the syntax for the property is the type of the data that it's manipulating, the name of the property, which by convention starts with a capital first letter, just like with method and class names. And then the get accessor is the word get followed by a function body, a method body, that typically just contains a return statement. But if you had to do some more elaborate logic to figure out what to return, those statements would simply appear before line 15 within the body. And then a set accessor for changing the value of the instance variable. In this case, we're assigning a value to the course name instance variable, and we're not doing any data validation, but if we did want to, we could do so before line 19 in the set accessor. And the value keyword is a contextual keyword that is automatically going to contain whatever gets assigned to the property. So if I go back to my main method here, and specifically line 19, automatically the word value inside the course name properties set accessor will contain whatever console.readline returns and is then being assigned into that property. So it's all just part of the syntax of defining a property. So down in our display message method, you can see that we've gone back to an empty set of parentheses. Because the display message method is inside the same class as the course name instance variable, I don't need to pass the course name to the method. It can simply use the course name that's built into the current gradebook object that I'm manipulating at a given time. And the way that we're accessing that here is we're saying to output the message, welcome to the gradebook 4, drop to the next line, and then in this placeholder, put in the value of the course name property. Well, what happens when I call the course name property here, or use the course name property here, is it goes up to the course name property definition, and because the context is to use the value, not change the value, there's no assignment going on here, it automatically invokes the get accessor, which returns the current value of the course name variable to this location in the code, which in turn places it into the placeholder within the string that's being displayed. And I'm going to step through all of this in the debugger for you so you can see where the flow of control is going in this program. So now that we've gone ahead and looked at the full new gradebook class definition, let's go back over to our gradebook test class and let's demonstrate the property course name in action, and also demonstrate the instance variable lowercase c course name and the fact that it is storing the gradebook value. So first thing I'm going to do is set a breakpoint here at line 14, because that's the first point at which I will have a gradebook object that's been created and I'm now starting to interact with that gradebook object. So I'll go ahead and start this in the debugger, and as you expect, it stops at the breakpoint. Now, by default, the debugger is set up to automatically step over properties. So if you go into the debug menu, you can see, oh, actually, I'm sorry, if you right-click the property name, you can see this option, step over properties and operators. In C#, you can, as you saw here, define properties for accessing data within a class. You can also define your own operators for manipulating data in a class as well. And by default, those are automatically going to be executed as step over commands when you're using the debugger. So I'm going to go ahead and uncheck that so we can see the property in action as we step through the program here. So what I want to do now is step into the course name property to show you what it's returning back to lines 14 and 15. So I'm going to go use the step into icon. And now you can see we're back in class gradebook within the property course name, about to execute the get accessor. Not only that, if I hover over the course name instance variable name, you can see that course name is currently null. By default, when you create a gradebook object that contains a string called course name, a string's default value is null, which is actually a value for any variable that can refer to an object, and it says that the variable does not currently refer to an object. So it's what you might refer to as a null reference. Course name can refer to a string object, but does not yet, because we have not yet assigned it a value. So what we're going to return here is the keyword null, the value null, back to the caller. So let me go ahead and step over that, and as I return, when I hit step over on the closing curly brace, the control will return to the caller. So now we're back at line 14, and we can see that my gradebook.courseName is the value null. And when you output the value null as a string, nothing appears. So what happens in this case is we get an empty set of single quote characters being displayed here. So if I finish this statement by stepping over once again and go look at the output window, you can see initial course name is and the empty string in single quotes. So the next thing we're going to do is prompt the user to enter the course name. So I'll step over that, and again, there's my prompt being displayed. All right. And next, what we're going to do is read in a line of text and store that line of text into the course name property. Now, the first step is to execute the console.readline. So I'm going to hit step into, and now it's waiting for me to enter the course name. So let's do a different course name this time. All right, so I'll go ahead and press enter. Now before I press enter here, what's going to happen is, because we're doing an assignment, the properties set accessor is what's going to get invoked. So when I hit enter, I expect to jump into the set accessor. Okay, so now we see in the source code here that we're about to execute the set accessor. As of right now, course name is still null because the value that I just entered, which you can see displayed in the tooltip now, has not yet been assigned to the course name. So now I'll do a step over to get to that statement, line 19, and I'll step over to change the value of the course name instance variable. And down here, by the way, notice the entry called this. That refers to the current gradebook object that's being manipulated, the one that we named my gradebook back in main. If I expand the plus sign next to that, you can see that the course name variable's value has been changed. And again, notice what's going on here. It's showing me both the name of the instance variable with this little icon with a lock on it indicating that it's a private instance variable, and this icon indicates a public property called course name, and it's showing the same value for both the instance variable and the property. The property doesn't have additional storage associated with it. It's just showing you what the get accessor of the course name property is going to return if you use it. So we can see that now the course name has been modified, and if I step back into main at this point, if I hover over course name, we can see that it is now CS102 Intro to Data Structures. And that means when I eventually display the message, I expect it to display that string. So I'm going to go ahead and step over that statement and step over the console.writeLine. So far we have just done the input at this point, and we're about to execute display message. I'm going to step into display message so that you can see display message is able to access the course name and knows about the course name that's stored in the current object being manipulated. You can see that by using the course name property here, it knows to use the string CS102 Intro to Data Structures as the value to be placed into this placeholder. So let's go ahead and execute that, and if I stop there for one moment, you can see that we've now displayed the welcome message with the new string that we just entered. We're about to return from display message back to the caller. So now we're in main at the end of main, and if I step twice more, my program will terminate. So we saw a couple of new features in this example. The first thing was how to use a property of a class to access data within the class, here in the case where we're getting a value to display, and here in a case where we're setting a value that was being input. We saw that a method can access data associated with the class without you having to pass the data into that method. And then just to summarize on the gradebook class itself, we introduced the concept of an instance variable, a public property for manipulating the private instance variable, and the display message method using the data within the class. And by the way, it's a good practice to use your properties within the body of the class name rather than, I could have put right here lowercase c and it would have used the course name variable, but it's actually a good practice to use the property instead, because let's assume that our property was more robust and provided validation. You would always want to make sure you're dealing with valid data, but also it helps make your code easier to modify, maintain, and debug down the line, and we'll talk in a lot more detail about those issues in subsequent lessons. Now, a couple of other things I wanted to point out in this example. In fact, I'm going to close this version of the example, and let me open up in the chapter 4 folder or the lesson 4 folder this other version of the same example with what are known as auto-implemented properties. There is a capability for properties where you don't do anything in the get accessor other than return the instance variable's value, and you don't do anything in the set accessor other than assign a value to the instance variable, called an auto-implemented property. And in this case, line 9 is that auto-implemented property. This is equivalent to the property course name that I defined in the original example, and it's saying to just do the default for a get accessor and the default for a set accessor. The default for a get accessor is to return an instance variable's value, and the default for a set accessor is to simply assign it a value. Now you'll notice that I did not define an instance variable here. When you use this form of auto-implemented property, it automatically creates for you an instance variable that is what you might refer to as the quote-unquote backing store for the course name property. So with this short syntax, you get for free a private instance variable of your class that the course name properties get and set accessors can manipulate. And just to show you, this is the same main method we just did. So if I go ahead and run this, we'll get the exact same results. I'll go back to CS 101, Intro to C# Programming for this one, and when I press enter, once again you can see that it was indeed able to manipulate the property the correct way based on the main method we defined. And you'll notice that we still access the property to get the value the same way as we did in the original program, and we still access the property to set the value in the same way as in the original program. Now, there is one additional thing I want to show you going back to the original program, which I forgot to point out. So let me bring up the main method once again in gradebook test. And the issue is that private piece of data called course name in our gradebook class. So we declared it as a private string. I wanted to point out explicitly to you that you cannot access the private data of class gradebook from class gradebook test. So to demonstrate that, I'm just going to go ahead and type my gradebook. By the way, notice as soon as I start typing that the IntelliSense window pops up, and now I can just type tab to fill in the full name of that variable. And if I put a dot here and I try to type lowercase c course name, notice there is no lowercase c course name showing up. Only the property course name shows up here because that's a public property of class gradebook. If I try to write course name with a lowercase c, and it automatically changed it to a capital C because again there is no course name lowercase c property name or public variable name. If I change it back to a lowercase c, you can see I'm getting an error message here saying that the variable course name is inaccessible due to its protection level. Public and private are member access specifiers that tell the compiler whether something is or is not accessible in a particular context. Anything that's private is known only within the class that declared it. Anything that's public can be used wherever that class is accessible.